Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Baking with Julian. We are working on our setup here, as you can see. We're having some issues with our overhead camera today. I just wanted to say that up front, so we're going to do our best in case that fizzles out. I would like to begin by thanking all of you for joining us, of course, and thank you so much to everybody who's able to toss a couple dollars on Venmo. My aunt and uncle sent me some money last week. It's really, really helpful to just keep upgrading our setup and to keep buying ingredients to test my recipes and share them with everybody. So thank you so much. If you're interested in throwing in a couple dollars on Venmo, my Venmo username is Chef Julian. Today I'm beyond because we are going to be looking at my mother Judy's cinnamon roll recipe, for which if you've ever lived near her, you know she's sort of locally famous for her sticky buns and cinnamon rolls, and these are so satisfying. The smell that comes out of your oven, it's the best thing ever. What we're actually going to begin with, I know probably not everybody's here yet, but I wanted to show you what the ready-to-bake cinnamon rolls looked like, since we're not going to be able to get to that in this hour. I made some yesterday, and I'll talk about the whole process of how I did that and what I did with them in the meanwhile. But right now, I want to actually take a look at the cinnamon rolls and show you what they look like when they're ready to go in the oven. When you press them like this, you see you leave a dent there, and it doesn't spring back. They're also puffed up and touching, which, as you'll see later, is not how they look when we put them in the pan. They're much more spaced out. That means they're ready to go in the oven. My oven is preheated to 375. I'm going to put these in. They only take about half an hour, so we'll have the satisfaction of seeing the finished product at the end of the class. Okay, and now that that's squared away, we can start talking turkey. So cinnamon rolls. Why do I love this recipe so much? Why did I choose this for our lineup this week, and what do I want to share with you about it? I think the biggest why of making cinnamon rolls pretty much goes without saying. It's an indulgent and extremely satisfying treat. It's just one of the most comfort foody foods you can really make at home. And they're actually remarkably easy. Part of the reason I say they're easy is because this dough is so easy to work with. My mom has been making this my whole life, and it's a really flexible dough. You can actually use it in a number of different ways. She makes sticky buns with it as well, which is a great use for it. It's also very forgiving. It's very flexible. It's very easy to work with. It's a really, really satisfying dough. And for me, part of the pleasure of actually making it is the smoothness of this dough. And just working it is just so much fun. This recipe that I'm going to give you today makes 15 large rolls. I would say large rolls. You saw the pan I just had. They're fairly decent sized rolls. What my mother has done, what you can easily do, is use half of this recipe for 15 rolls also. It just makes 15 slightly smaller rolls. And you could even use the same pan size. They'll end up a little lower and a little more spread out. So this is for a 9x13 pan. Anything you've got that's close to that is probably okay. And before I start baking anything, I always like to get my pan prepped. And all I've done to prep my pan today is rub it with a tablespoon or two of soft butter. That's really all it needs. It doesn't need flour or anything else like that. Very, very simple. So let's talk about our ingredients then. For our dough, we're going to need about 5.5 cups of all-purpose flour. We're going to divide that into three different parts. The first part is 3 cups, or about 15 ounces. The second bowl of flour then would be, or the second addition of flour we're going to do is going to be 2 cups, or about 10 ounces. I've then got almost another cup. It's about a half cup on the side, and I'm going to incorporate some of that as I go along. I weighed everything and tested everything yesterday, and I used exactly 5.5 cups, or 27.5 ounces for the whole recipe. We're going to start with 3 cups, then we're going to go to 2 cups, and then we're going to add about a half cup more as we knead the dough. Our next ingredient, of course, is sugar. We're going to use half a cup, or 3.75 ounces. Baking powder, we're going to use 2 teaspoons. Kosher salt, 1 tablespoon. If you have just table salt, fine, use 1.5 teaspoons. Use just half as much salt. This is where the recipe tends to get a little tricky, because what we're going to use next in terms of our ingredient list is going to depend on what kind of yeast we're using. I use instant yeast. Sometimes this is marketed as rapid rise or something like this, but what that means when you see an instant yeast is that you can add it directly to your dry ingredients, and you don't have to sort of bloom it in warm water. You don't have to activate it, it's already active. If we're using instant yeast, we'll use 1 tablespoon. If we're using active dry yeast, we'll use a little bit more than that, 2 packets of that, which is about 4.5 teaspoons. It's about 1.5 tablespoons. Then for the liquid ingredients, if you're using instant yeast, I would say use 14 ounces or 1 3/4 cups of buttermilk. If you're using active dry yeast, you're going to reduce that to 1 1/4 cups, and then you're going to bloom your yeast in 1/2 cup of warm water. So if you're baking along at home right now, there's going to be plenty of time to catch up because the kneading is going to take a little while and we're going to do this live. So if you're using active dry yeast, I would go ahead and put 2 packets of that in 1/2 cup of warm water right now and let it start to bloom. Don't worry, we'll have plenty of time to catch up. And I'm going to repeat the quantities of the ingredients as I make the dough for you. So that's our liquid. We're also going to add a teaspoon of vanilla to the dough and 2 eggs and 4 ounces or 8 tablespoons of soft butter. When I posted the link on the Melt website earlier, that you really want your butter to soften. If you have a microwave, great. I don't have a microwave, but you really, really want soft butter for this. It's the only way to work it into this dough. And then to spread butter on the rolled out dough, which we're going to do, as you'll see, is impossible with anything but soft butter. Speaking of what we're going to spread out on our dough, we have our filling, which is another 4 ounces or 8 tablespoons of butter, another 1/2 cup or 3.75 ounces of sugar, and a full tablespoon of cinnamon. And a quick note about cinnamon, which I mentioned last week when we made coffee cake, is if you folks are not aware of Burlap and Barrel, you should really check them out. It's my friend Ethan and Ori's spice company. They do single origin spice sourcing. They travel around the world finding underprivileged farmers in developing countries and pay them more than they would make in any other way. So it's a really beautiful company, really great social mission. And on top of that, it is world-class spices. You can read all about it online, Burlap and Barrel. I'm using the Royal Cinnamon, which is a Vietnamese type cinnamon, a Saigon cinnamon for this, my personal favorite. Any kind of cinnamon you love is the right cinnamon to use for this. That's it for our filling. Finally, for our glaze, which we'll do when these come out of the oven here in 20 minutes or so, is 2 cups of confectioner sugar, which is about 1/2 pound, 8 ounces. Just a 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla. You can up it a little bit if you want. Don't go crazy on it because it's going to add liquid to your confectioner sugar and that will thin things out quite a bit. And then I put 2 ounces. We're going to see how that plays. I'm going to show you live what it looks like to change the consistency of this glaze. I'm going to use milk, or I'm going to use buttermilk rather. I thought, let's try it with buttermilk. The buttermilk I think would be a great flavor. There's buttermilk in the dough. If you don't have buttermilk or you don't like buttermilk, certainly just use milk. It's totally fine. That's just about 2 ounces or 4 tablespoons, 1/4 cup. And then just another 1/2 teaspoon of cinnamon really rounds things out nicely. So we'll go over those ingredient quantities again in practice as we put everything together. Speaking of putting everything together, I think we should just get started with our dough. So we're going to start with our main work bowl here. And I'm going to add that first measure of flour that I mentioned. So this is 3 cups of all-purpose flour, about 15 ounces. I'm going to add 1/2 cup of sugar, 3.75 ounces. My baking powder, 2 teaspoons. My salt, 1 tablespoon. And because I'm using instant yeast, I'm going to take a tablespoon of that and put it right on top. I'm going to mix this together like this. If anybody has questions during this process, please feel free to post them in the Zoom chat. We have a moderator who will be able to communicate those to me. Just make sure you post your questions to everyone. It's really helpful if everybody can see them. Okay, that's the entire process for mixing our dry ingredients. They're just sort of mixed around. Now we're going to begin adding our wet ingredients, starting with, because I'm using instant yeast, 14 ounces or 1 3/4 cups of buttermilk. And I'm just going to use a spoon to get that out of there because buttermilk is a little clingy. Then I'm going to add 2 eggs, a teaspoon of vanilla, and then 4 ounces, 8 tablespoons of butter. You can see this is nice and soft. It could even be softer if I'm being honest, but this will work. So now we're going to just mix this together, get everything moistened. You can certainly use a mixer for this process up to a point. I don't like to knead this dough in a mixer. I like to do it by hand, and that's something that my mother discovered in making them results in a much more tender, beautiful dough. Now, this isn't quite mixed enough yet. This isn't like coffee cake, or we did scones a few weeks ago, where we have to be really cautious about gluten development, especially there's not that much flour in here yet. You see these big chunks of butter, we've got to smooth those out. You can sort of smash them against the side of the bowl. That's a really easy way to kind of get them smoothed out. You want this to look pretty uniform before we do anything else to it. So change your grip on your spoon and just give it a little hack. Really just mix it up. It's starting to smooth out. If the softer your butter is, the easier this step is. So it's really worth giving it time to soften. Mine was out overnight, actually. And this is much easier than the dough I made yesterday for the rolls that I'm baking now, because my butter was not quite soft enough yesterday. Much warmer in the kitchen today. All right, I'm satisfied with that. I don't see any pieces of butter. Things seem uniformly mixed. We're ready for our next step. This is 2 cups of flour, or 10 ounces. This is our second addition of flour, and we're going to just add that right to the bowl. And we're going to mix it around. Now, this is where we're going to have to start to work a little bit harder. This is where you might want to use a mixer. You could certainly use a mixer up to this point. I am just going to turn this like this. What we're looking for here is essentially just a cohesive dough. Not necessarily perfectly even, just holding together, no loose flour, so that when you turn it over, there's not dry matter at the bottom of the bowl. I'm pretty happy with that. I think that's pretty good. We're about ready for the kneading portion. We're going to knead it for quite a while, so great time for questions while we knead our dough. I'm going to show you that technique too. Great, I'm happy with that. I'm going to clean off my spoon, get that dough in there. I am not going to bother cleaning off my hand because it's going to go right back in. All right. Now we have our last measure of flour. This is actually about a cup in here. I know from my practice yesterday, I'm going to use about half a cup of this. I'm going to just start by sprinkling some over the top and then just sort of turning this dough over and sprinkling a little more there. It just makes it more handleable, more manageable. Okay? That is it. The really beautiful part about this dough too, a little spoiler for you, is that you don't need to let it rise a first time. You can go immediately into shaping. We have one quick question before I get started with kneading. The question is, are we using salted or unsalted butter? I always would use unsalted butter if I had it on hand. Reason being that I don't know how much salt is in salted butter. I know how much salt is in this dough. If all you have is salted butter, that's totally fine. I would cut your salt about in half. Butter, the level of salt in salted butter is not a prescribed thing. It can be different for different manufacturers. It can be different from one batch to the next. I know exactly how much salt is in this dough. So that's why I use unsalted butter. I'm going to just lightly flour my work surface. I think there's one more question before we start our kneading. This is an interesting question. Sifted or unsifted? It doesn't really matter if you sift this flour or not. The thing that you need to do sort of more consistently in baking, we'll take a moment and just chat about it. If you can get a scale, a baker's scale, I have a brand that I love. I'm happy to talk about it if you'd like. You know, they do not need to be expensive. Not only do you, all these little bowls you see me adding of pre-measured stuff, that's not how I bake in the real world. That's how I bake so I can do it efficiently for you. However, if you are weighing things directly into your work bowl, there's fewer dishes to wash and worry about. Also, accuracy is 1,000 times better. I did a demonstration when I was teaching at Williams-Sonoma years ago about the weight of your cup of flour versus the weight of my cup of flour. The cup is the same size, but the way we measure it, I saw one that was 4 ounces and I saw one that was 7 ounces. It was almost twice as much. So sifting isn't really necessary these days. That's kind of an old-fashioned thing in baking. It was just to make sure that there weren't any lumps or whatever. Manufacturing is a little more consistent now. So I wouldn't worry so much about sifting. What I would worry about more is measuring accurately. The way that I measure flour, which comes out to about 5 ounces a cup, is I stir it around in the container that it's in, or the bag, that's what it's in. I'm gonna wait one moment. It's that kind of time, you know? And then I would take my measuring cup, dip it in. and then don't shake it or tap it, just dip it in, and then with a level object like the back of a knife, just sweep it off. They call that method actually dip and sweep. That gives me about a 5-ounce cup of flour, and that's how I calc. So, and to answer that question sort of the long way, no need to sift, just try to measure consistently. The more you bake, the more you'll understand how you measure flour and how it plays out. All right, so let's look at kneading, and my moderator will interrupt me with any questions during the kneading process. So this kneading is really cool, and what I do is what my mother did is 200 turns, and I actually count them. I'm probably going to lose count a little bit today, but we just fold the dough around itself and roll it away. And then turn it a quarter of a turn. It's sticking to my counter, right? Add more flour. This isn't a place to be stingy with flour. It's going to incorporate beautifully into the dough, so if it starts to stick, just add a little more. I would always add flour to the work surface so that the wet side of the dough, so to speak, the stickier side of the dough, folds in on itself. It's more likely to stick properly. When it starts to stick, more flour. The process of doing this is so deeply satisfying because you feel the dough change under your hand. You feel the result of the effort you're giving it. You feel it become smoother. You can feel the gluten develop. And when this is got its full 200 turns, or 200 turns, I guess is the right word, when we've turned it and pressed it, kneaded it 200 times, that's just about the right number. You may go a little longer, you may go a little less long. The important thing is the end result. And the reason that you might do it in fewer turns or more turns than I do is that you might knead with a different strength than I do. If I'm really rushing to make these like I used to when I had them on a brunch menu, I would push very hard and do really big motions and really work that gluten. I could usually get it in a little bit under 200 turns. But 200 is not that much. Lets you reflect on the things in life that you have to be grateful for. Any questions while we're kneading? This is the longest process, but I really wanted to show you the entire thing because this is something that trips people up. It's one of the most effortful steps in baking, but there's no reason to be afraid of it. This is a really supple, you can see I'm not horsing on this. I'm not working up a sweat. My kitchen's about 90 degrees today, so. We're gonna keep kneading this. Is anybody counting? If you have an estimate, go ahead and post it in the chat because I have no idea. I'm guessing I'm near 100 based on how this dough is handling. We do have a question. I've got a question that is pretty common in baking, and of course that is, can you use a gluten-free flour? Here's my philosophy on gluten-free. Obviously, if you need to avoid gluten, you should absolutely be gluten-free. A recipe like this, I don't think works very well gluten-free. I'm sure you can get them. The other thing is, too, I'm a really firm believer in not making something that's just good enough. And to bake something like this in a gluten-free context is not something I've studied, and I would not be comfortable giving you advice about that. The gluten in this flour is the protein in it, of course, and it plays a really important role in this particular product. Muffins, some kinds of cakes, a lot of kind of cakes, scones that we did a few weeks ago, coffee cake that we did last week. Beautiful, beautiful place for gluten-free because we don't want to develop gluten in those recipes. We're going to do some gluten-free cookies in a future class, so that'll be a fun place to look. This is essentially bread. So when you take something that gives bread its structure, which is gluten, and take it away, a lot of things have to change. And I sadly don't know enough about it on a professional level to really know how you can make this. What I can tell you is the coffee cake from last week would leave no one wanting, and you could amp the cinnamon up in that. It's got sour cream or buttermilk in it. It's a beautiful, beautiful breakfast food. So I would be happy to look at some resources. If you want to leave your email address in the chat, I'd be happy to look at some resources and see if I can find a reliable, but what looks to me like a good, logical, gluten-free recipe to share with you. All right, I think we are just about there. And this is based not on counting anymore, but if I look at this dough, it is beautifully smooth. It is just workable and nice and pliable. Feels very even. Here's a little trick I'm going to show you that I really, really enjoy. You know we're going to roll this out into a rectangle. Like, that's going to happen. So start with a rectangle, end with a rectangle. Press it like an envelope fold like that. We're already rectangular, so that is going to be a big help in rolling that out into a rectangle. All right, so just press it down lightly to seal that. And I'm going to make that, yeah, I guess that can be the upside of my dough. I'm going to lift it and just set it to the side on a little bit of floured counter with the same side down. And then I'm going to flour again, just lightly. And this is just because we're going to apply pressure to it now. We're going to roll it out, and we don't want it to stick. This is the place where it would be really heartbreaking if it did stick. So that's our dough. As I said before, the really nice thing about this recipe is that we don't have to wait. We don't have to let this rise or anything like that. We're going to move immediately into shaping. That being said, this is going to resist a little bit. That gluten that we just worked so hard to develop will want to relax a little bit. So don't hesitate to walk away from this if it's just not cooperating with you. Be patient, go slowly. Don't put too much pressure on it. Let it just do its thing in the time that it needs. So if you find it's just springing back as you roll it, and we'll see it will, feel free to walk away. Also, and another thing that adds to the great flexibility of this dough, that's all you have time for, pop it in the fridge. You know, maybe put a little oil in your bowl. I like, you know, like a light vegetable oil, even little melted butter in your bowl. Put it smooth side down in that, and then flip it over so that the top has a little oily coating on it, just to help keep it from drying out. Cover that with plastic, pop it in the fridge, come back to it. You can come back to it the next day. A chilled dough that's this rich is beautiful to work with. It will roll out like a dream. It's actually really, really fun. If we ever get to croissants, homemade croissants or puff pastry, you'll see what a chilled dough looks like. It's an amazing thing to work with. We're not going to chill this. We're going to get right into it. So without further ado, I will grab one of the more important tools in the process, and that is a rolling pin. My brother Michael gave me this rolling pin. He looked at it with a carpenter's eye, and that's the right eye for this, because I do like the taper here. When you're doing a pie dough, it's really, really good to be able to roll on that taper to get a nice rounded corner, a nice rounded edge on the pie dough. But also, the flat section is very long on this. It's got a gentle taper. Sometimes they almost seem pointy in the middle. That I don't like. That's great for tiny, tiny little things. This is my favorite all-purpose general rolling pin I've ever had. So thanks, Michael. Like rolling any dough, the key is to just work small, work a little bit at a time, and move your dough often. Better to find out now if it's sticking, where you can easily pick it back up. And get your hands in the process. Form it into a rectangle as you go along. Press it down. If it's even, you're going to have a better time rolling. If your pin needs it, put a little flour on it. Roll it back and forth, roll it side to side. We're ultimately shooting for a rectangle that is about 15 inches by 9 inches, about. Now, that's for half this recipe. I use the same size rectangle for the full size recipe. We're gonna just keep at it. We're gonna just make sure we're not sticking. We stuck a tiny little bit, so just kick another tiny bit of flour under there. You can move it around. Encourage it. This is not challenging. I mean, rolling is something that is a skill that I've certainly developed over time. When I worked at the Lever House restaurant with my friend Rachel, we had a pecan pie on the menu one year for restaurant week. So we made, I think, 800 pecan pies that week. You get pretty good at rolling when you have to do something like that 800 times. So as much of a rectangle, you can see that it is shrinking back. You know what I sometimes do is I encourage it to shrink back. That tells me where it's going. It doesn't need to go any farther than that. Helps me get it rectangular again. I'm just gonna give a tiny coating of flour just because my dough felt a little tacky. And now you see it's really cooperating. This is a beautiful dough. It's one of the reasons I chose this recipe today to share with you is because it is just so enjoyable to work with. If you get frustrated, if it's not cooperating, walk away. Go have a glass of iced coffee and come back to it. It will wait for you. I mean, don't walk away for 2 hours or anything, but you could walk away for 10, 15 minutes, and you'll come back to find a more workable dough. That's probably slightly bigger than 9 by 15, although not much. A really good check is, I've got my pan. That's about a 9 by 13 pan, so that's just about right. That's a really, really good eyeball, so you're not, you're not out here with a measuring tape on your baking counter. All right, I'm pretty happy with that. I'm gonna give it one more roll just to even it out. Feel your dough, make sure it's even. You know, if mine was just a little heavy on this end, you can press it, you can continue rolling it. And I wanna just go like this too, one more time. I wanna get a little more depth on that. All right, I'm happy with that. That looks really, really good. So that's our rolling process. The next step we're gonna do is fill this. This is where it's really crucial to have soft, soft butter. So if you need to wait, cover this with plastic, it'll wait for you, but let your butter be soft. You have to spread it essentially. So, the softer it is, the easier that's gonna go. If it's a little cool, my kitchen was cool yesterday. As I mentioned, I don't have a microwave. I used my hand to spread it. So it's really handy to keep a couple paper towels nearby so you can wipe that butter off your fingers. We can also use a tool that you've seen me use before, and that is our offset spreader. Really handy for this because it's just like spreading icing. And if you think of frosting, right, that's about the texture your butter should be. So back to our dough, we'll get our butter here. I'm just gonna check this. This is pretty soft. I think in an ideal world, I might even use a brush. This is not maybe brush soft, but definitely I can use my offset spreader. So just get a bunch on there or use your hand and just spread it like that. Beautiful. You see, waiting for that butter to soften, kind of planning that part ahead a little bit, of course, makes it really easy. Don't try to spread it all smooth on the first pass. You'll just ruin your dough. You'll have to be pressing too hard. So just get it on your dough, right? That's the main thing for our first step here. Okay, so we'll get that pretty evenly, really to the edges. You really want to go right to the edges on this. I love an offset spreader. It is it's a $7 tool on your favorite online shopping site, and it is just indispensable. I use it for so many things. We have one quick question.
Can you melt it in the microwave and brush it on?
The question is, can you melt the butter in the microwave and brush it on? I would soften it in the microwave and do this. I would not use melted butter here. You could use melted butter here if you were doing a sticky bun. That would be fine. I would use soft butter as opposed to melted here. It's going to do some things. So it's going to do, one thing is going to help it's not going to run, 4 ounces of melted butter would be too much for this. It would run off the edges, and then you're in a real mess. But the other thing that it would do is it wouldn't allow our filling to adhere quite as nicely. A third thing that it'll do is in the oven, that butter, because it's got, it's still semi-solid, it's got some water suspended in it. When it hits the hot oven, that's going to steam open, and that's going to push these rolls apart and up, and it's going to make them even more beautiful. So I would say not melted, unless you're doing sticky buns, and then you're probably going to use a little bit less. I can get some quantities and post those. Again, just drop me your email if you'd like communication about that, or email me at julianpleiter@gmail.com. Now for our actual filling, another ½ cup of sugar. That was 4 ounces, by the way, of butter, 8 more tablespoons. ½ a cup of sugar and a full tablespoon of cinnamon. This is going to seem like too much, and I'm going to ask you to trust me when I tell you that you should use it all. It's a cinnamon roll. It should be very cinnamony, and you'll be really glad you did. And you'll be surprised by the time you're done rolling it up, like how much it really isn't. It's not as much as it seems. Okay, so just toss that together lightly, and then carefully, you want to make sure you get this pretty much to the edges and corners. Just shake it over there a little bit at a time. Start slow until you're sure you've got it all covered. And then you can really just sort of dump it on. Okay? And again, we can just take this and just very lightly with your hand, which hopefully is not buttery. When it does get buttery, that's what happens, but that's okay. Remember, this is going to be layers and layers and layers inside, so you're not going to see any of this stuff. All right, so we're filled. We're ready to roll. My hands are clean enough. This is all going to get rolled into more cinnamon anyway, so I'm not so worried. starting at one edge, we're working with the long edge of the dough always. Just tuck it in. Don't worry about making a tight cylinder. It's not a tube of toothpaste or anything like that. Just sort of turn that up, okay? And then working in the opposite direction, start to roll it up. You're going to feel that you're stretching the dough. This is something that gluten allows you to do, right? You're going to feel that happening as you go along. Try not to do it too much because you'll make it thin. You want to handle it. So I like to pull it. You see, I can kind of pull it and do that. Pull it and lay it down. Just tiny little pulls though. Don't make it too thin at this point because then you might break through. And again, it's not the end of the world if you do. You're going to roll it into itself. So it's not like anybody's going to notice. Plus, I tend to not re-invite people who notice stuff like that. But we're just going to gently but confidently roll that up. All right, we have one question while we're doing this.
Dough is the right dimensions, but seems thicker than your dough.
The comment was that the dough is the right dimensions, but it seems thicker than my dough. And now that might be the case. Feel free if you are, I would say it was a good ½ inch thick. It's thinner now, okay, because I'm stretching and pulling it. And this is much longer than it was. If I pull my pan back here and we look at that, you're going to see it's quite a bit longer than it was before. It's almost twice. So that's just a natural part of the process that happens as we work with this, is that it will tend to stretch out a little bit. So I would say go for it. Maybe roll it out a little bit more if it makes you more comfortable, but keep in mind it's going to get even bigger as we roll it up. And I can tell you from the smell in this kitchen that I have just a few seconds left before I'm going to need to step away and check my oven, which will be very rewarding. So when you're finished here, and we may have to come back to this if I have to step away, just roll it onto the seam. I'm going to leave that there for one moment while I check my oven. All right, I'm going to give you a spoiler. That's right. They're nicely browned there. They're still pale a little bit in here. They're firm, but at the same time, that you can tell that they're very spongy. We're going to talk about the leavening in these when we come back to them. All right. So I'm going to set those to the side. Now we'll come back to our cylinder here. Keep your hands pretty dry. Keep your hands dry. Add flour if you need to, just so they, mar your dough. You don't want it to just stick at this point. So roll it over so you see the seam. Okay. Now you can see at the end here, it sort of stops. There's not. I'll turn it around so you can see it better. It's not a perfectly even rectangle. It doesn't go all the way to the end. You can still kind of use this section. It might be a slightly smaller roll, but feel free to just kind of like fake it. That's what we're doing. Then as we move along our cylinder here, and I'm only moving it so you can see, we're just going to pinch that closed just so it stays sealed. Okay? Moving along the cylinder. And same thing at this end. As you can see, it doesn't really go, to the end. So feel free to help it. That's what we're here to do, right? Pinch that closed. All right. Now, what I think is a good idea to do at this point is to take a nice sharp knife and just cut the ends off where you know it's not a full cinnamon roll. Don't throw those away. We're going to find a home for those, believe me. Move your cylinder back over. If your counter needs flour to do all this, add some flour. Cut the other end off. Now we've got a nice even-ended roll where we're going to get a real cinnamon roll the whole way through this as we cut it. So flip it back over, smooth it out a little bit, try not to stretch it too much, but yeah, round it out a little bit so it's nice and uniform. Now, with the back edge of our knife or with the side of our offset scraper, we're going to just sort of mark on this dough where we want to cut it. That'll give us an idea. I've done this recipe and only made 12 rolls. They were gigantic and extremely satisfying. I've also done it with 15. And there's nothing unsatisfying about a small cinnamon roll. You just have more. So I'm just going to dock it here. I'm just going to mark it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and a big one. So I'm going to cut that into, I'm actually going to try now to cut that into 15 pieces by going a little bit bigger than where I made those marks. You could certainly remark it. You're not pressing very hard, you're just leaving a really light impression. I'm pretty happy with that cut. So those are our cinnamon rolls. The next step we're going to do here is put these in our pan. So just slide them so you made a little room. Get your prepared pan. And I'm going to do 3 rows of 5. You're going to notice they're spaced much longer one way than they are the other. This is actually a smaller pan than the other one I worked with. So that's actually really good that that happened, because I'm going to show you what it looks like with just a dozen. I'll put the other 3 or 4 in another pan because I wouldn't want to add another row here. You have to sort of adjust this based on your own environment. I do have 3 extra. What I've sometimes done with these is I have a tiny little cake pan, a small pie pan, a tart pan, whatever that is. I love to put these in there, and those are the ones you can eat right away. These you're saving for company, right? So we'll tend to those in a little bit. So that's our process for shaping and panning our cinnamon rolls. It's so satisfying. It's so easy. Just remember to give it time. Remember to take your time with it, and don't rush it and don't force it. Just listen to it. Now is the waiting part. So we're going to cover that with plastic wrap, and I'm going to let that sit for probably an hour, hour and a half. You want to see it doubled in size. And for those of you who are here at the very beginning of the video, I showed you the rolls that we just baked before they went into the oven, and we saw what that looked like. So if for those of you that joined after I demonstrated that, I'm sorry, I wanted to get them in the oven. There will be a recording available. You're basically looking for them to about double in size. All of this space in between everything here will be completely closed in. And then when you press them lightly with a floured or wet fingertip, it'll leave that impression there. It won't spring back, or it'll spring back very slowly. That will let you know that they're right. You could freeze them right here. You can refrigerate them right here. What I did yesterday was I made the rolls in the evening. I put them right into the fridge. I pulled them out this morning about 2 hours before I put them in the oven. They warmed up. My kitchen was quite warm. You might need longer than that. If your kitchen is a cool room temperature, 68 or so, I would say give them even 3 hours and put them in when they're ready. Get your oven fully preheated and let them do that way. It's a really, really great make ahead. There's nothing satisfying as a cinnamon roll on a Saturday morning with your cup of coffee, especially when you didn't have to do anything except put it in the oven. That's really, really good. The other thing you can do with them right now is freeze them. And when my dad and brothers and I and my cousins and nephews all go fishing every year, my mom makes a pan of these to send along with us for every morning that we're there. And she sends them frozen. We keep them frozen the night before from frozen, just in a pan like this. If you're using a disposable thing, if you're going somewhere, if we could go somewhere, the night before, pull them out and let them sit on the counter. In the morning, they will be ready to go. They'll be ready to bake. It's just miraculous. That's why I love this dough so much. It's just so easy. It has 2 forms of leavening in it. It has yeast, which is going to be a slower kind of rising. The yeast is organic. It happens over time. Baking powder is a chemical leavener. So what that does is when it gets in the oven, that gives it a lot more stuff. It's activated by heat. You see double acting. Baking powder is activated in 2 ways. It's got the old classic baking soda vinegar trick going on with acid and alkaline. That's one way in which it acts to help things expand. And it's heat activated as well. That says double acting. So you get the combination of both of these leaveners working together, and it makes a beautiful, beautiful texture. It's not as dense as it would be or as bready as it would be if you use just yeast. That's why another reason why I'm a big fan of this dough. Let's take a look at our last step. Unless there are any questions about that so far, I'd like to look at our last step while we have time and glaze the rolls that we just pulled out. The glaze is perhaps the easiest part of this whole equation. So let's take a look at that. I've got my 2 cups of confectioner sugar right here. We do have a quick question before I do the glazing. Oh yeah, that was a good question with these little scraps at the end. These are chef's treats. So bake them with your other rolls if you have extras. Bake them on a little metal plate, bake them on a little tart pan, freeze them, throw them away if you must. But I like to have this little ugly duckling here, and it's just an extra little treat. That's a good question. Confectioner sugar. To that we're going to add just a ½ teaspoon of vanilla. Careful on your vanilla. You can go up to a teaspoon. Just be cautious. If you add too much, this will get too loose. This is a ½ teaspoon of cinnamon. You could probably add a teaspoon if you really, really want it to be very cinnamony. I like to add just a touch here. And I'm going to take my buttermilk and I'm going to add 2 ounces. I've gotten okay at eyeballing this, so I'm going to eyeball it. 1, 2. Okay. So that's about 1/4 cup of buttermilk, hopefully. And we're just going to mix this up here like this. I had a question too. Someone asked about how long to let the dough rest and what was the baking time. The dough doesn't need to rest before you shape it. Once it's in the pan, I think about an hour and a half is what I would generally give it. Baking time is 25 to 30 minutes. I did mine 375. I did mine for exactly 30 minutes, and they look perfect to me. If you're doing a smaller recipe, if you're doing half this recipe, you're going to want a slightly shorter baking time. I know my mom bakes hers at exactly 25 minutes. So, as with all things, take a peek, look in there and see what things look like. Don't trust the timer, the recipe. Me here, I don't know more than you do about what's happening in your kitchen. So take a look and pay attention and learn to judge when things are ready and things are done. I'm going to add just a touch more buttermilk to this because I want it to be a little bit looser. You know, one way that I've enjoyed these before too is with more of a buttercream type frosting, which is how I used to get them at the mall when I was a kid with my brothers at one of the famous, actually at a slightly less famous kitchen or a cinnamon roll place. And I have to say, I feel like I really like the glaze better on these. I feel like the cinnamon roll itself is so tasty and so good. I feel like the buttercream, when I've had it, I've been disappointed because it overwhelms the roll. I'm going to get the pan of freshly baked rolls. There that is. This is great to do when they're still nice and hot. So you've got your glaze here. You can see the consistency of this glaze. It's moving very slowly, but that's good. You want it to move slowly. Take your time with it. Be patient. This is going to be hard to show you, but I'm just going to sort of pour it out of the bowl here, starting at one end, and try to move evenly. See the ribboning on there. The heat of these rolls will help that glaze smooth out as well. If you find that you've used too much glaze, hopefully you have a little more confectioner sugar and can whip up more. Glaze is also a personal taste thing. You may want more, you may want less. If you want these to look really, really completely evenly coated in glaze, if that's your thing, totally fine. If you're taking them to some sort of a thing, when we're allowed to gather again, or even if you're just making them for your family and you want them to look really, really nice, or for the most deserving party of all, just for yourself, and you want them to look really nice, feel free to, I would say, use 1.5 times as much glaze and really spread it out. You can use your offset spreader or a rubber spatula to just sort of spread it. It'll be great. And I'm actually going to do a little bit of that action right now. One more question here.
Should you glaze them when they're hot?
I do like to glaze these when they're hot because I find that it makes the glaze easier to sort of spread evenly. I'm going to go in on this. Don't, I'm not squishing them. These aren't meringues. Like they can handle it. They're bread essentially. So that helps you get that glaze spread to all the corners of all the rolls. Well, I don't know what to do next. Actually, I take that back. I know exactly what to do next, but this part I probably shouldn't be on camera for because I'm going to embarrass myself. Cut these out with a little spatula. Enjoy them hot, enjoy them warm. Don't burn your mouth. These are beautiful. You can also freeze these baked. They're easy to reheat in a toaster oven, a slow toaster. It's so versatile, it's so friendly, it's so fun, and it's the absolute best cinnamon roll ever. So thank you for joining. Any other questions right now? Feel free to post. If you didn't get your question answered, we'll review the chat, or feel free to email me, Julian Plyter, Plyter, @gmail.com. I'm going to post this on YouTube, so you could always post a comment there if you have a question. As always, I try to keep the links sort of centralized right now on the Melt website, meltbakery.com. My email is julianplyter@gmail.com. My Venmo is Chef Julian, if anybody wants to toss in a few dollars so we can keep buying stuff and improving. And we have a couple questions at the end here.
What was the oven temperature?
The oven temperature again is 375. So I'll just really quickly go through the whole process again. Mix your dough. Knead your dough 200 times, is the magic number. Roll it out about 9 by 13. Spread your butter on it and fill it. Roll it up. We haven't stopped now. We haven't let anything rest. Your pan is prepped with a little butter. 12 to 15 rolls depending on your pan. Okay. I always, in my normal pan, which is a little bit bigger than the pan I showed you today when I was actually panning this for you, the pan I baked in today that I made the dough for yesterday fits 15 really comfortably. Then, you can refrigerate your dough before rolling out. You can refrigerate the rolls after forming. You can freeze the rolls after forming. You can, bake it immediately. Well, not immediately. You have to let it rise about an hour and a half at a warm room temperature, maybe 2 hours, until they're nice and puffed up and no space in between and they're ready to go. 375, fully preheated 375. This size recipe, half an hour. Half the recipe, I'd say 25 minutes. And then glaze them while they're still hot and wait as long as you can to eat one. Or don't. That's cinnamon rolls. Thank you guys so much for sharing this time with me in this one of the most treasured recipes of my childhood and adulthood, if I'm honest. And welcome any comments you have. Next week, I think, is going to be a really fun class. I think we're going to cover some 101 stuff. So it might be 4 shorter segments where we talk about, well, why this flour versus that flour? Why can't I make this gluten-free, or why can I make this gluten-free? Buttermilk versus milk, salt, sugar, it's all so much. So maybe we'll do a couple shorter segments next week and take a look at that. Happy to hear any suggestions on content, on time, if this is not a convenient time for everybody, although you're all here now, but I appreciate that. But if there's something we can do better, I want to know about it. Thanks again for any Venmo donations helping us improve our setup, get a more reliable second camera, and really, really appreciate you guys watching. So excited to share this with you. We'll see you next time on Baking with Julian. Thanks so much for joining us today, and stay safe. Bye, everybody.